And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of a film.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Hello, ladies and gents. What you're about to hear is a collaboration that I recorded just over a month ago with a man who has a show on YouTube. It's called Apoloneering. You won't catch it on your podcasting platform of choice. It's exclusively a YouTube channel, video format show, but I only have the audio here. If you do want to see the video version, I'll try to upload it to the Eschaton YouTube channel in the next week or so here, or you can just check out Apoloneering and you might have it there. But in any case, this was a show we had planned a little while back. He actually reached out to me through social media a couple months back when he got wind of my show and asked if I'd be up for doing some sort of collaboration. And I said, yeah, for sure. Just depends on the content and when schedules align. Well, at the time, and also just because it's an area of interest for both of us, the recent information around government intel around UFOs and extraterrestrial life and all the related topics that you guys have been probably hearing about in the headlines, all those things were kind of just breaking. So we said, hey, how about we do an episode on UFOs? And we basically decided to go back to the progenesis of all this, basically trace, the origin of UFO sightings and work our way up to the modern time. And we go back farther than you might think as a starting point, but that should be to expected for those of you who are longtime Eschaton listeners. But in any case, I hope you like it. This isn't a genuine Eschaton episode, so I wanted to preface with that. There will be more content coming from Eschaton in the near future. I've been a bit absent over the past month and a half. Part of that is because of vacation. I took a 2.5-week vacation earlier in June, which I'll tell you guys about soon in an upcoming episode. Amazing experience. I'll tell you all about it. But then additionally, things have been pretty crazy with my day job. So between family, work, and all the other things that life throws at us, it's just been tough to get behind the microphone. But fear not, for those of you who have been waiting for new content, it is coming. I have a couple of solo episodes in the works. Daniel will be back on the show to cover news and the like in the not too distant future. And then I have at least one, possibly two, really exciting interviews lined up for you guys that I know you're going to enjoy. So stay tuned for all that. It won't be a long wait from now until that content starts pouring out. But until then, I hope this holds you all over. Enjoy. This is a collaboration with Seth McVey from Apoloneering.
Well, man, we got an exciting discussion for you today. It's not really an interview, and so this is going to be something different. Welcome to the channel, guys. My name is Seth for Apoloneering. I'll be kind of your host along with Josh, and man, I'm super excited for this conversation. Today's topic is going to be UFOs, aliens, the agenda, the conspiracies, we're going to cover everything. Well, not everything. It's a big topic, as you guys are aware of. So we're excited for this. Josh and I have been talking about a collaboration for a while now. And as you guys know, I recently joined Josh Peck's YouTube channel, The Daily Renegade, his website, The Daily Renegade. Make sure you guys check that out. You can become a member, $10 a month, $100 a year. You guys know the drill if you checked out some of my other videos. But please consider becoming a member, because we're getting censored on YouTube, and so in order to get you guys the information that you want, you need to go check that out. And so you get exclusive content that non-members don't get. And so also subscribe, click the bell to the channel below. And if you're interested, hit me up, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the feels. You know what I'm doing. So also I wanted to do a little bit of a plug for Josh here. Josh, as I'll get more into in his bio, he hosts a podcast called Eschaton, and you guys need to go check that out. It's on all the platforms as well, iTunes. Is it on Spotify, Josh?
It is. You can find it on Spotify, Spreaker, all the above.
All right, and it's really good. It's fringe, conspiracy, daily news, all that kind of stuff. So if you're into this type of content, you're definitely going to be into Josh's podcast. So make sure you guys hit that up on iTunes. So I'm going to introduce Josh for my guests, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about myself for Josh's audience who may have never heard me before. So Josh Wisely is an independent researcher and host of Eschaton, a podcast that explores a range of topics from esoteric and ancient history to current events and global affairs. Eschaton just recently celebrated its second birthday, so if you would like to check it out, you can listen to the entire back catalog of episodes for free at joshwisely.com or by subscribing to Eschaton on Apple iTunes. All right, and for Josh's audience, my name is Seth McVey. I started a YouTube channel called Apoloneering. It's morphed from interviewing people who have come out of the occult and various religions and the occult to Christianity. It was originally meant to be a testimony platform to let people share their testimonies, and it's kind of evolved. I still do that, but I also have incorporated interviewing researchers who may know a lot about a specific topic, like Freemasonry or UFOs or whatever it may be, whatever the topic may be. And so I wanted to start to include some of that stuff. So I've been doing that for about 6 months now. So Josh is way ahead of me. So that's a little bit about me. Josh, how's it going tonight, man?
Seth, it's going well, man. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be a good time. I know we've been discussing this for a few months now, but and we've done a little bit of research on the side for this discussion. So I'm excited to see where it goes. You brought up some things that I had never heard of, and so it's going to be fun to talk about. So today, where do we want to begin?
Well, I think we should start right at the beginning, man, like the earliest recorded accounts of this phenomena. So you and I had some conversations offline over the phone over the last couple of weeks where we've talked about our own ideas and suppositions about what the UFO phenomena might be and what the origins of it are. Some people might trace that back to Roswell. They might trace it back to World War II and, accounts of Foo Fighters, things like that, which we'll talk about later. But a lot of people have said that these things have been spotted as abnormal phenomena and abnormal sightings for millennia, literally millennia. We can go back and we can look at accounts possibly in the Bible, which we'll talk about in a moment here. We can look at accounts in other ancient religions and cultures, such as the Vedas, the sacred Indian text written in Sanskrit, where they talk about flying vimanas. You can see artwork and architecture that actually has representations of cigar-shaped flying discs going back at least 2,000 years ago. So it's interesting to say the least, and whether or not we're looking at a continuation of one phenomena or a correlation between multiple phenomena that have some sort of similar origin point. Time will tell, and maybe the research that others have done and the research that you and I have done can start to kind of piece that mosaic together. But I think we should start at the beginning. So you brought up a good point, actually, in reference to the Old Testament, I believe, with the book of Ezekiel. So I think that's as good a place as any to jump in.
Yeah, I completely agree with your assessment there, Josh. And the reason I brought up Ezekiel, and it's interesting because you have had Mike Heiser on your show. I've had Mike Heiser on my show. One of the big research platforms that he's been into is the Book of Enoch, and there's a bunch of researchers that go into the Book of Enoch, and people argue for whether the Book of Enoch should be canon or not. But some people argue that it's the oldest book that's like ever written because it was written by Enoch, who was seventh generation from Adam. But as Mike Heiser would say, that's not the oldest text. It was put together by scribes in I think the 3rd, 4th century BC. Or 2nd century BC. So you brought up you mentioned that I had talked about Ezekiel, and I brought Ezekiel up because Ezekiel was written before Enoch. And so I kind of wanted to start there with Ezekiel's vision. And if you guys, the listeners, you guys have ever heard of ancient aliens or anything that has to do with the History Channel that they do on it, I'm sure Ezekiel chapter 1 has been brought up because, it's a weird sight especially coming from a modern viewpoint. So I kind of wanted to start there, and we can discuss this. And it's interesting how you were talking about just all the various, ancient texts that have all this weird phenomena, these flying craft as it may be. But it's interesting because Ezekiel, and in order to gain a good understanding of what Ezekiel's talking about, you really have to know Babylonian iconography. And so I pulled up a blog from Mike Heiser, and so he is the resident and scholar at Logos software, company or whatever. And he wrote an article on this exact thing, explaining exactly what is going on in Ezekiel chapter 1. And so to not read the whole article, I'm just going to give an overview. But here it says, we are prone to make assumptions about God and his favor when life has us down due to sin, mistakes, or incomprehensible circumstances. Of all the scripture passages we might turn to during those times, the bizarre vision that opens the book of Ezekiel would not register high on our list. However, reading this passage with its original ancient context in mind reveals a powerful message for its original recipients and for every believer. And I think, especially when it comes to the UFO phenomena, we really have to take it in context, because as we'll get into later, it's there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of disinformation, and so it's really hard to parse the true from the fake. And so in chapter 1 of Ezekiel, sorry, I really want people to understand where we're coming from on this, but Ezekiel has this vision in Babylon. If you guys read Ezekiel chapter 1, you can see it, and it's talking about wheels within wheels. It's talking about these four-faced living creatures. It's talking about silverly flying things, the clouds opening, the Most High coming down on the clouds, and all of this terminology, okay? And it talks about rims and eyes and all this terminology. What Ezekiel is seeing is none other than a royal throne. And so I mentioned earlier Babylonian context. This is exactly what a Babylonian king or deity would ride around in. So if you guys can picture Egyptian pharaohs riding around in a chariot, Mike Heiser just explains it similar to that the deities, the Babylonian deities in particular, are riding around this. And I want to finish with just Ezekiel on this meaning of it. Why is Ezekiel seeing something that's Babylonian? So Ezekiel, Mike Heiser says, Ezekiel's imagery sends a message to the Jews in exile and to their Babylonian captors. Both assumptions are flawed. And the assumptions that the Babylonians and the Jews had made is that Yahweh had been defeated by the Babylonian gods, and the Jews weren't God's chosen people. So this vision that Ezekiel's seeing says that those assumptions are flawed. Yahweh could not be defeated, nor has he returned away from his people Israel. He remains seated in his chariot throne at the center of his domain, the entire cosmos. And so this UFO phenomena, supposedly claimed by ancient alien subscribers and ancient astronaut subscribers, is none other than a Babylonian throne, a deity throne that's flying around in the heavens, and Yahweh uses that to poke fun at these gods. So I thought it was interesting that we'd start there, because just from that passage, as we'll talk about later, this is a supernatural event.
Yeah, definitely makes sense that the imagery would be Babylonian, given that Ezekiel was one of the Hebrew captives. He's at the River Kibar when he has this vision. And to me, that does sound like a supernatural or a psychedelic almost, like in the modern sense of what we use, like an out-of-body experience type vision, where he actually, it says, for several days after that, couldn't even speak properly. He's just mumbling by the river after seeing that. So, I mean, that's like something that somebody who had been on a couple day spiritual journey nowadays with some sort of psychedelic, like, mescaline or peyote or something like that, we would say they're crazy. Well, his contemporaries probably thought he was crazy coming back from this vision. And then he comes back and he talks about wheels within wheels. I definitely sympathize with Dr. Heiser in the sense that this does seem to be a royal throne and a royal procession that Ezekiel was seeing. But I do recall reading a book, I was a teenager at the time. It's a very old book from the 70s. It's called The Bible and Flying Saucers. And it was kind of like a forerunner to this ancient astronaut theory. And you and I, have similar views, I believe, on ancient astronauts and kind of the grasping at straws that they do to kind of make the narrative work there. But there are there's some interesting things that they do point out, like, you know, the shape of the wheels. It does sound like what somebody who saw a flying disc would describe it as in 3,000 years ago. I mean, that's probably the way I would describe it, the way Ezekiel described it. He says it moves, you know, at a kind of an angular type motion, the same way that people say that, you know, with these UFO sightings, they see them take off and turn at a 90-degree angle, something that no other aircraft can do simply because of the laws of physics. So the parallels there are interesting. I'm not throwing my hat in the ring saying that Ezekiel saw a UFO, but I do think it's interesting that the Indian script, the Sanskrit script, they talk about the Vimanas as basically these, for lack of a better word, Eric von Donigen's term, chariot of the gods. I mean, that's what they said they were, that these flying Vimanas were basically vehicles by which the gods get around, which opens all sorts of theological and ontological questions about, you know, the nature of deity and the nature and the purpose of existence. Because, you know, if the gods are flying around in vehicles, then you have to start questioning things like, you know, omnipotence, and can gods, you know, are gods like humans? Do they need vehicles to transport, or, you know, are they basically just advanced beings with more souped up technology than what we might have access to? So it opens all sorts of questions like that, and you can really just dive down that rabbit hole if you want to go the technological route. I remember seeing this, you know, this narrative portrayed in the Star Trek movie a few years ago, where basically an advanced civilization stumbles upon a primitive civilization, and, you know, they try not to be seen because they don't want to interfere with the development of that civilization, right? It's kind of like if you or I stumbled upon an anthill, you know? Like, those ants aren't going to understand us. I mean, they would see us as a threat to their world, and if we tried to explain the nature of existence or architecture or art or creativity or poetry to them, they would never grasp it, right? So some people take that approach to this idea of the gods basically just being advanced beings from millions of light years away who have come to check us out, but they keep their distance as if we're like living in some sort of an aquarium or something like that, and they're just observing us as if we're in captivity in a zoo. So that's one argument there. Again, I don't throw my hat into that ring, but I see the narrative and I see why people would take that conclusion. But as you said, and as I often say in my podcast, which is a platform where we deal very much with ancient history, you have to interpret things within the context in which they were written and presented. Ezekiel was a Hebrew captive living in Babylon, and I think he is recounting an example of a Babylonian deity procession. So this would have been Marduk in Babylonian context. And he's basically doing what the Jews do so often in the Old Testament, of basically saying, my God is better than your God, and we're going to use your language and your symbolism to represent that. You see it in the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 with basic the language there. You don't really get it in the English, but in the Hebrew, this idea of the Elohim, or God, hovering over the face of the deep. The deep there, the word Tehum, is Tiamat, who is a Babylonian deity. She's a goddess of chaos, a serpent. She's a water deity. And basically you see, in the Hebrew context there, you're seeing the Hebrew god subduing chaos, the Babylonian deity Tiamat, which is like a revisionist take on the story of Marduk and how the Babylonian gods came into power. So all that to say that this is not something unique in the sense that the Hebrews weren't known for doing this kind of thing with their prophecy and their literature, especially in the Old Testament. So I don't think Ezekiel could easily be chalked up as a UFO sighting, but I do find it interesting. And as you can kind of tell, I'm kind of on the fence as to whether or not this could be something that classifies as a UFO type phenomena.
Yeah, you know, and now that you say that, it's interesting because, you know, why the rise in this UFO saucer type? Like, you know, why that particular shape? And it's interesting because, you know, I was listening to another Mike Kaiser interview, and he was talking about how, well, they didn't need to present themselves that way back then. They didn't need to have this flying saucer look. They their cosmology was, basically that there's gods elsewhere. We get the Roman pantheon, we get the Greek pantheon. The Hebrews had all of this understanding. The Egyptian pantheon, they understood this, and so it's interesting that these gods would present themselves in different ways. And as we start heading into the more of the modern thing, it's going to be super interesting to see how the gods present themselves now and in the future, right? With the presentation of Thor in Avengers and
Right.
a Norse god, so it's going to be super fascinating to see that. But another interesting thing that I was thinking about when you were talking was how the writers aren't zapped with supernatural knowledge. They're writing, what they witnessed, what they saw. And it's interesting that the Lord would present himself this way. But he's speaking to them in a way that they understand. And I think it's important for us as Christians to understand that God speaks to you where you're at. He doesn't zap you with this, lightning bolt, and you just are suddenly aware of information that you never would have had. He speaks to you where you're at, and he wants to have a personal relationship with you where you're at now today. And so I think it's interesting. I take that away from Ezekiel's experience, since I don't know why, but that's something that stood out to me. And it also reminds me of in Acts chapter 10 with Peter, the Lord, because Ezekiel here is having a vision, right? So this is inspired of the Lord. And that's another thing that we can get into with the alien phenomenon, is that is it us seeking this stuff out, or is it the Lord bringing it to us? Because in Ezekiel and Peter's instant in Acts 10, it was the Lord that gave them a vision, right? And he spoke to them about, events that are in their time and day. But I don't know why that came to my mind, but Acts 10 just suddenly popped into my head. So you were talking about the Vedas. What does the Veda mention about UFOs, or what is the common thinking or whatever with that text? Because I've never heard of that.
Yes, I don't know if most people would say that it does mention UFOs. There's a lot of debate over what the Vimanas were, but I mean, there's no doubt that they do reference in Sanskrit this concept of a vehicle that the gods not only flew around in, but they actually did battle in the skies, actually combated each other with these vehicles, which makes it sound, less like a god, more like just, modern technology now. I mean, if we could go back, not even go back in time, let's say two militaries are having a conflict over the Amazon rainforest in South America. There's a few undiscovered tribes that still live there. We know they're there, but we just keep our distance. Now imagine that those tribes see two F-16 fighter jets, basically basically flying sorties above them, and then one day they get into a conflict and one shoots down the other. Those people, had they had no exposure to the outside world, would have their minds freaking blown, right? They would say, wow, the gods are fighting above us in the heavens. Now, some people say that that's what this was. This was just advanced civilization, or maybe even advanced civilization on Earth, not one from off planet that's lost to time. Something like, the Atlantis story, something like that. I don't put much stock in that at all. I've never really put a lot of stock in the idea of Atlantis in the sense that it had modern technology. There may have very well been a nation state like Atlantis that lived in peace and tranquility and had wisdom and understanding of, sacred geometry and things like that. But I don't think they had electricity and that they were flying vehicles like we are today. So what I think personally that the Indian Sanskrit text, is talking about is basically either an authentic, UFO encounter where an advanced civilization did appear and they had some sort of encounter with it, or metaphorical language, some sort of representation of their deities. In the sense that the Old Testament often talks about Yahweh riding on the clouds, right? That's imagery that the Canaanites used for Baal. Actually, Baal was called the cloud rider. Well, the Hebrews, as they like to do, they make fun of the other gods to show their own God's supremacy by using that cultural context. So they know that Baal is known as the cloud rider, and they say, our God, Elohim, Yahweh, he rides on the clouds, which is, it's twofold. One is to say our God is better than your God, and the other is to say that our God basically is above us. He's transcendent above us. He can do anything. He controls the
Right.
cosmos. So is that, if you were to take that literally, we would see a god riding on the clouds in the sky. I don't think that that's the case, obviously. I think it's metaphorical language. In Sanskrit, the Vedas do some of the same thing. However, I think the argument could be made that the Vedas are actually spoken of more as a matter of fact, like technology type of a vehicle, rather than just a metaphorical description of the nature of the gods. So, and plus in Hindu religion, you've got millions of deities, literally millions of deities.
Right.
So this idea of many of them flying around in vehicles in the sky wouldn't sound as foreign as it would to you and I growing up in a Western post-Christian civilization. So it could very well be a authentic UFO documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that's kind of a good segue into the Book of Enoch, which I mentioned earlier was written 3rd, 4th, 2nd century BC, put together by these scribes, and it's a it's pseudo-named, after Enoch, because Enoch is the main character. But what the Book of Enoch is actually doing is relaying the worldview of the scribes and Hebrews at that time that they were writing. So their worldview was that, if you guys haven't read the Book of Enoch details the sons of God, which was 200 angels descending upon Mount Hermon, taking human wives in exchange for teaching humanity the metallurgy, cosmetics, the art of war. All of these teachings were given to man. If you can picture like a predator type, alien versus predator type field there. But that's exactly what Enoch is supposedly supposed to have witnessed. And so, which ties into Genesis chapter 6, as you probably all know. But the Book of Enoch then details, Ezekiel flying around in the heavens on some sort of aircraft, seeing all of these different things, after the angels had been imprisoned, he goes down to them and they ask him to go up to Yahweh to ask if they can get released, or if there's any way for them to repent. And then, he sees all these apocalyptic type events happening, which, like I said, was the belief of the people who were writing the book. And so, the reason that we bring Enoch up is because he is flying around in this aircraft. Now, what do you think that was, Josh? What I mean, is that some sort of just transportation that Yahweh, similar to like what Philip experiences, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a little bit of a caveat that ties into Enoch here. I've actually been doing some research for an episode for my podcast on the context of Enoch and, the 70 watchers descending on Mount Hermon and that story itself, because you read that story in its context in the, first chapter of Enoch. It says that Semjaza, Azazel, and all the other, fallen ones who came with them, that they were bound. They were to be bound in the earth for, I believe it said 70 generations. Well, one time I did the math on that based on what, the length of time would be. And I corroborated this with a couple of others who had done this before. It wasn't anything new. And by some estimations, that 70 generation bondage were these fallen angels, which is where this idea of Tartarus comes from as well, right? I mean, the Titans being bound by the gods in the underworld.
Which is what Peter writes about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, the timeline of when they would have been released pretty closely coincides with the birth of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. So it's kind of interesting. So I refer to that time period as, I call it the quickening, because that's really when industry and technology started to roll faster and faster with all sorts of, machine capabilities, the steam engine, things like that, to the point that within 100, 150 years, we have, astronauts in space. It's mind-blowing how fast it happened. It's actually where I get the name. the name for my podcast is twofold, but the straightforward representation of the word eschaton literally means time at the end of itself, accelerating, that things start happening quicker and quicker.
Wow.
And it's the root word for eschatology, the study of the end times. Now, that wasn't the only reason for the naming of that podcast, but it's the key definition here for eschaton is that at the end, things will start happening quicker and quicker, which is why I call this period from the Industrial Revolution till now the quickening, because in about 200 years we've had more advancement than in the last 2,000.
Yeah.
Is that a coincidence? Some would say, yeah. I mean, you're able to harness the power of electricity through Ben Franklin, then obviously all these other things are going to start happening pretty quickly right after. However, if we go back and we take Enoch seriously, and we do believe that these angels, Semjaza, Azazel, and the others were really as powerful as it said they were, that they were able to teach all these things to mankind. If they were bound for 70 generations, and if those generations of bondage ended around the time of our Industrial Revolution, then is it possible that they were released on Earth just in time to go and share, once again, some sort of secret knowledge with mankind? It might sound far-fetched at face value, but I think to your audience and to mine, people are willing to entertain that idea. We know that secret societies, occult wisdom have been around for a long time. People like John Dee, who I just did a podcast on a couple months ago, was
007.
Yeah, I mean, people have been talking and writing about these things, sometimes subversively, to stay out of the crosshairs of the Catholic Church, but nonetheless, people have been studying these things continuously since the beginning of recorded history. So it's not too far-fetched to think, in my opinion, that these entities who are capable of imparting sacred or advanced knowledge to humanity could have been freed up on the Earth, and this would account for our quote-unquote alien encounters and the various different races of them. They come as Nordics, Greys, Reptilians. All this kind of starts popping up in the 20th century, coincidentally, as I said, right around the time of the Industrial Revolution really picking up steam, technology moving on, and the same time period where these angels or these fallen ones would have been re-released from their bondage back into the Earth. So I think, to answer your question, that Enoch's account of a flying vehicle could very well have been some sort of a flying vehicle that maybe not Yahweh himself was, riding around on. Perhaps, why not? But it could have been something that was being utilized by these, fallen angels, or just these regular, sons of God, as they're called. Doesn't sound too far-fetched to me at all, to be honest with you. And the more I look into it, and the more I cross-reference it with other accounts, like the Vedas, like the modern accounts of, the Foo Fighters in World War II, which we'll talk about in a minute, it does seem like there's some synchronicity there. The alternative, as I said, would just be metaphorical language. I think either he really did fly in a craft that the gods utilize for transportation, in which case you have to define what a god is, or it was metaphorical language and he was just doing his best to describe something that was foreign to him.
Yeah, I like that explanation, and you set it up perfectly for where we want to head next, and that's kind of the more modern type stuff. But before we get into that, I while you were speaking, that a passage came to mind in Revelation, which talks about the abyss opening up and the steam coming out, and all of these demons who had been held in Tartarus, or angels, or whatever entities they are, come out of the abyss, and they're let loose on the earth to bring basically hell to earth. And so do you think that there's a similarity between what we saw with the Industrial Revolution, what Enoch describes as the 70 generations, and then is that correlating, in your opinion, to Revelation at all?
It's possible, man. It's possible. So I've always kind of taken a partial preterist sort of view to understanding eschatology. I think a lot of the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the 70 AD, in that time period when Rome did sack, the holy city. A lot of that seems to match up pretty perfectly, but I don't rule out the idea of a double fulfillment, and I don't rule out the idea that some things are fulfilled in ways that we couldn't perceive at the time. I definitely think that idea of the abyss opening up and, demons being free on the earth matches the type of metaphorical apocalyptic type language that you see in Ezekiel, you see in Daniel, you see in the New Testament in a couple of places. So I think, it could very well be the same thing that Enoch's talking about. These deities, powerful deities, and by deity I really mean like fallen ones, they would have been released on the earth at this time. And I don't think that there's ever going to be a time in the future where we're going to see the ground literally open up and giant gods coming out of the ground. As crazy and wild as that would be, I think that this is something that happens more in the spiritual realm. And very much so, yeah, to answer your question, I think that this could be a fulfillment of this idea of the 70 generations, and then at the end times, these things being released on the earth once again for a limited period of time to wreak havoc. And to your point, what does it mean when they bring about evil and chaos on the earth? Because you could pretty easily make a case that we're living through one of the most evil and chaotic times. Not in the sense that like people are sinning or doing debaucherous things any worse than they have. People have always done debaucherous things, but in the sense that the definition of what it is to live a quality life is changing. Like people have become more disengaged. The family structure has been called into question. The roles of men and women are really being redefined as we speak. Due to the internet and technology in general, people can be more apathetic and disengaged than they ever could have been before in history. And it makes you wonder, through all sorts of mediums like radio, television, internet, it makes you wonder if there's somebody pulling the strings behind all that, because it feels too perfect that this is all coming together right now in our time. And it feels like we're building towards some sort of cataclysm. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's the return of Christ or the apocalypse, but it does feel like we're building up to this ultimate event where either we're going to have a radical transformation in the definition of what it is to be human, or what it is to be a creature living on Earth with cognitive abilities, or we're going to get sent back into the Stone Age through nuclear war or just obliterating ourselves. So it does seem like we're on the precipice of something like that, and it very much could be, powers at play behind the scenes that would account for the beings that you see in Book of Enoch, for example.
Yeah, dude, absolutely. And also just kind of stepping into the more modern understanding of UFOs, of the alien phenomenon. It's interesting that, Enoch talks about these 70 generations and kind of leading up into the Industrial Revolution, what year do you think that was? Or what years would you place the Industrial Revolution in?
I don't know if I'd put it in a really narrow window, but I would definitely put it in the second half of the 1800s. Like, you're looking at the Gilded Age and like factories popping up. This is like post-Civil War Reconstruction era, probably. So like 1870s to 1890s, somewhere around there. Because by the early 1900s, you've got like the Titanic, the Queen of the Seas, and like these giant ships, and then you've got people flying airplanes within 20, 30 years after that. It just seemed like it started happening really fast. Right. So I'd put it around that time frame.
And the reason I asked that is because I just wanted to make sure that was the same time period that I had in my mind. But before I said what I was going to say, I wanted to make sure. But it's interesting because right around that time also, you started to get a lot of occultism starting to rise up. And if your listeners know, and my listeners know him, Carl Teicher just recently released a book called The Game of Gods. And in this book, he kind of goes through history, laying out, the works of postmodernism, modernism, and all that stuff, and how we've kind of evolved through each of those, and how we're now in a postmodern worldview, where basically that's anti-Christian. But we saw with the end of the Industrial Revolution, as people had experienced this horrible civil war, especially in America, World War II and World War I were kind of building up towards that. So there was this kind of like what we're feeling now. There's this build of, almost like anxiety in the world. Like the spiritual forces are just like raining down anxiety on us. But what we saw through that at the end of the Industrial Revolution was this need for spirituality, which kind of exploded with occultism. And what we saw with that was two people arose that were, in my opinion, super effective in occultism, and maybe even with the alien phenomenon. Those two people were L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons, and Aleister Crowley, actually. So three people. So what happened with this? Aleister Crowley started to work with sex magic rituals, trying to open portals to bring entities through to our realm, right? And so, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard were disciples of Crowley, and they, in their famous Babylon working, did something similar where they were trying to bring this moon goddess into our realm and basically bring along the apocalypse. So I find it interesting as we transition here into the modern period that it started with Enoch saying, or, the book of Enoch stating that there's these 70 generations. Through your math, through various other people's math, it's been confirmed that that was kind of around the time of the Industrial Revolution, which then leads into this explosion of occultism and these people trying to open portals to bring these other entities through. So it's as we start entering into, I think it's good to have that background because we begin to understand that people are looking for something. Mm-hmm. People are expecting this supernatural experience, whether that be aliens or UFOs or whatever. They're starting to see this more and more. So how do you think that all of this occult activity that late 1800s, early 1900s, even up until we get into Nazi Germany here in a second, but how do you see that playing a role in what we're seeing today, and maybe how that transition to the attitude of today?
Great question. You set that up beautifully too, by the way. That is absolutely spot on with those three names, especially with Parsons and Crowley, because for most people probably know this if you know anything about Jack Parsons, but he actually worked on the rocket program that eventually would become NASA's space program, interestingly enough, right? And then Crowley, to your point, he had a house on Loch Ness in Scotland where he actually would do all sorts of rituals to try to invoke spirits and call them in, which is interesting because that's where you get the famous Loch Ness sightings, right? A serpent, a water serpent, back to Tiamat.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then, he actually said that one time he channeled an entity and he drew a picture of it. He has a sketch of it. It was called Lamb. You know the Lamb story, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you look at Lamb, he looks pretty much like a gray. So, it's eerily similar, right? That this occultic narrative that starts popping up in the early 1900s, Crowley referred to himself and others started to refer to him as the Great Beast. But he was consulted by British secret intelligence, during the Great War. So, this guy was a power player, and he was rubbing shoulders with some of the elite of the elite. So to think that there's not some sort of interplay there is interesting, because the segue from Crowley into the Nazi era that we're discussing here is that the Nazis were very much into occultism too, right? They were into this idea of the supreme Nordic race, and it just so happens that one of the three popular races that people talk about with the modern alien phenomena is the Nordics, right? So you have the Nordics, you have the Greys, you have the reptilians. Some people say there's many more, but those are the three that are kind of like the default. And the Nazis were really trying to tap into that in the 1930s and the 1940s. So I think, to answer your question, that Crowley is kind of like, it may not be him directly, but since he's the household name, I think the people of that fold were the gatekeepers, the ones who kicked the door wide open when they realized that power was available to tap into it, and they let it in. And who knows what they let in, right? Who knows what they let in? But something changed, because in the 20th century, with cameras and things like that, people started to get more sightings, obviously. But something changed. There was a big uptick, not only in the New Age and the esoteric, but in this phenomena of, orbs and balls of fire in the sky and flying discs. And again, I think that it correlates almost perfectly with this idea of Enoch's, fallen angels being released into the world at that time, and then these occultics, the occultists of that generation, Crowley, Parsons, Hubbard, others, being the ones that really kicked the door open wide and just brought it in full force.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because right around that time also we started to get an explosion in cults. You talk about Mormonism, you talk about Seventh-day Adventism, you talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, with all of their founders having some sort of supernatural experience coming out of it, saying, hey, I know the truth. I saw this entity, or this entity appeared to me, and I want to develop this religion out of it. So it wasn't just an explosion in occultism. It was also an explosion in cultism, where the enemy, it seems like, and that's where we get into the supernatural part of this, why would the enemy or these aliens or these entities or whatever you want to call them, the Nordics, the Greys, the reptilians, why are they targeting Christianity particularly? Why are they trying to downplay who Jesus was, right? Because that's ultimately what all these cults have in common. They can never agree on who Jesus is. They never, or it never agrees with the Bible. So we also see that rise in the cults that arise in America and elsewhere. But it's just interesting that it all climaxes right around the turn of the 19th or the 20th century, right? Or 18th. 19th century, 18th century. Excuse me. Sorry. I got a lot of things going through my mind. But so let's start diving into the Nazis, because they for our modern understanding of UFOs, of aliens, I think they're kind of the predecessor. Would you agree with, or kind of the just the beginning point of it? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the cliche image of the flying saucer, that really goes back to the Nazi era. So I believe it was 1942. The Nazis actually were testing this, and this was leaked knowledge. So we actually have footage of them trying to fly a flying disc in the 1940s. Actually, I probably went back to the first trials in the 1930s, before the West even got into the war with the Nazis. But for the most part, the Nazis' public record was that it failed. They were never successful with actually getting one of these flying discs to fly. But by the time the war's in full swing and you've got all these fighter pilots from the UK and from France and from the States flying sorties all over Europe, they're saying that they're seeing these flying saucers all the time. I mean, in fact, multiple pilots recount close encounters on a semi-regular basis. So much so that they even developed a name for these things. They started calling them Foo Fighters. And they basically,
right.
it would be like a tongue-in-cheek thing, right? Like, oh, another Foo Fighter sighting today. So I believe that was Nazi tech. I don't think that this was, supernatural entities or aliens from another galaxy visiting us and watching us during the war. I do think the Nazis were successful. Whether or not they got that technology from some other source of intelligence, that's another question entirely. But I do think that this phenomenon was really birthed with something that the Nazi scientists, who were well ahead of Western scientists at this time, discovered and tapped into. What's interesting as well is that a lot of the reports of these flying crafts actually report that the metallic type exterior of the craft would have hieroglyphics or some sort of ancient language written on the actual craft itself, which would definitely make me think it was Nazi technology because, as I said, they were very much into occultism. So these could have been Nordic runes. It could have been hieroglyphics. I don't know, and I don't think most people would have a trained eye to be able to decipher that. But It would be interesting to be able to know and have that evidence firsthand, because I think we could easily figure out who was behind it if that was the case, and also if there was a spiritual component, which I personally believe that there is, not necessarily to the development of this technology in the human sense, but I think the premises of it, the origin of it, came from some sort of supernatural technology that was given to us or imparted to us, and that we were able to customize it and modify it. And basically, as the war wound down, the Nazis realized it was a losing effort. Those scientists were intentionally targeted by the USSR and the US to continue on that program. So I'm talking about Operation Paperclip here, and guys like Werner von Braun and all sorts of scientists would have been scooped up by the Soviets and by the Americans, and then that work would have continued on secretly behind the scenes for the next several decades, taking us right up to Roswell and the mass outbreak of sightings of triangular-shaped UFOs and flying saucers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Up until the present day.
Yep. Yeah, I like that introduction to the Nazis because, and one thing that you have to realize with for those who are watching me and I'm looking down, I'm actually looking at a book. If you guys haven't read this book, Empire Beneath the Ice by Steve Quayle, you guys need to get it because he just dissects Nazi Germany, everything from their technology to their occult beliefs, and so I'm looking at some pages here, and it's interesting because everything that Josh was talking about, it can be validated with a paper trail. So the Nazis were actually very good at keeping their drawings of their designs, their calculations and everything like that. And so, it just seems that we have to begin kind of discussing Hitler and Himmler. So if you guys have done any research into Nazi Germany, you'll know that the SS, which was Hitler's just his mighty men, I guess you could say, and they were led by a guy named Himmler. And so he was in charge of this. Basically, he was charged with going out into the world and finding all of these sacred artifacts that were supposedly based on myths. So this is where you get like the Indiana Jones thing with the Ark of the Covenant, and the
That's all
Holy
based
Grail.
On Himmler,
and so there's the German guy that is supposed to represent Himmler in that, but I think it's important to start there because that establishes, as Josh was talking about, the basis for everything that Nazi Germany did. So they believed that there was this race that was supposed to govern the world, and this was to them the Aryan race. And if you actually trace the Aryans back, it's interesting because a lot of scholars find that the Aryans can be traced to northern India. Which goes back to what we were talking about with the Vedas and stuff. But they also believed in this hollow earth, this Shambhala, paradise existing within the earth where these beings exist today. And so that's what they were trying to find. And that's what they thought that they needed to annihilate everyone out of the earth that wasn't supposedly from this ancient race, which goes back to theosophy, which we didn't even hit on with Helena Blavatsky. Yeah. But it's important because Himmler was part of the Vril Society and eventually joined with the Thule Society, and they practiced mediumship. So they had a series of women who would stand in a circle and they would all do this medium occult stuff, asking for guidance from these gods who were supposed to give them information on technology. We're supposed to give them information on power, how to gain power, supernatural power, how to take over the world, essentially. But it's argued that this is where a lot of this technology came from. It's argued that they gained information on anti-gravity, they gained information on zero-point gravity, they gained information on thrust, to make these vehicles go, thousands of miles per hour when, in that time, that was just ridiculous thinking. So it's super interesting to start talking about the Vril Society and its link to Nazi Germany because the Vril just goes back to... sorry, my son is talking to me right now. Hang on a second.
No problem.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that, man.
No problem. I just got mine to bed before we started.
Yeah, I was. Mine. He's gonna be going to bed here soon. So, I was trying to think, and he was talking at the same time, so it was hard. The Vril Society. I think it's important to start with the Vril Society and understand kind of what they were teaching, and it goes to this mediumship where they were contacting the spiritual world, right? They were doing occult practices, and hang on a sec. Oh, I know where I was. So we were talking about the Vril Society and just how the Nazi, especially the high-ranking, and you can't group all of the Nazi officers and privates and everything in this category because I'm sure there were great guys there as well. But in the higher ranks of Nazi infantry and as you get to the generals and things like that, they were really involved in this spiritual stuff. They were really involved in practicing occultism through contacting the spirit world. And one of the reasons why I think this is because they realized how much power there was there, supposed power. And if you ever do any research into Satanism or witchcraft, that's how these demons dupe you. They make you think that you have more power than you actually have, and then one day they just turn on you and your power means nothing. And so it's interesting that the Nazis were doing this. They were contacting the spirit world to gain information on this technology that they were developing. And so one of the things that they developed was, and Steve Quayle writes about this in his book, it was called the Die Glock, or the bell. And it was their wonder weapon, and it was actually exposed as having anti-gravity mechanisms in it and everything. So this is an example, or this is what it looked like. So it looked like a bell, like one of those, like the Liberty Bell or something you have in that. And so this was supposedly one of the first wonder weapons that they were developing. And as they got further into their tech and stuff like that, they obviously started getting the more saucer look. But was it just in Nazi Germany that this happened, or was it spread throughout the world? Like, who else got this tech, Josh?
Well, I think after the war, it definitely spread to the West for sure. I mean, you can pretty much trace the paper trail of the secret space program or the flight program to the Southwest, right out in your neck of the woods, right? This is, the earliest reports of Area 51, and then Roswell comes and all that. But I mean, people were talking about some weird things going on there in the 50s. So you're talking like Korean War time, right after World War II, well before, everything really blew up in the 60s and 70s, ultimately leading up to when I think it kind of became like a covert arms race. Because to answer your question again, I don't think it was just the United States that got access to this. Over 1,500 Nazi scientists were scooped up by other countries after the war ended in Operation Paperclip. They didn't all come to the States. Some went to the USSR, some went to the UK, others went to undisclosed locations. But Hitler wasn't working alone even at that time. I think the Italians were involved in this under Mussolini. It's interesting because that was one of the first places where some of these cigar-shaped and disc-shaped UFOs started to appear, was over Italy. So it just lines up too perfect to think that it was just the Germans doing this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of those scientists that were brought over through Operation Paperclip, I can't remember the guy's name. Oh, it was Galen. I can't remember his first name, but he was a general, and he actually turned on Hitler before the war even ended because he saw where the war was going. He thought he saw imminent defeat. And so he actually used his knowledge of the USSR to gain access, if you will, into the U.S. military, and they sent him overseas to England to conduct more research into the USSR. And so he was bringing in scientists and things like that to work for him. But it just goes to show you that these scientists were spread all over the world, not to mention the scientists that escaped via U-boat to Antarctica to this base that is a controversial subject, but it was argued that there's a base in Antarctica that the Germans were developing, which Admiral Byrd was sent to in Operation High Jump after the war had ended. And they ran into all of these flying saucer machines down there. They had like a battle infantry go down there. Yeah, I mean, Admiral Byrd, he experienced everything that, we would think that, if the Germans had all this technology, they were able to fight with it, if that is true. So it just goes to show you that the Nazis were developing this tech, and it seems to be that they were successful in developing it. Now, I've also done some research into what the Japanese were doing. The Japanese supposedly also had these flying desk technology as well. And Mike Heiser, who we've mentioned a number of times, he also in one of his books documents how the Roswell crashing was one of these Japanese experiments through Unit 731, which is where the Manchurian Candidate comes from. But they were experimenting on people who looked like Greys, who were these dwarfs with slanted eyes, and they had all this stuff. They were testing with high altitude, with freeze thaw, but they were also testing saucer technology tied to weather balloons. And so if you look at the Roswell incident, there's accounts where it was just a weather balloon. There's accounts that it was this crash thing, but it could have been both. So, this tech spread throughout the world. Now, where do you think that's leading us today, Josh? What's the big hullabaloo about this UFO alien phenomenon, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, to quote from, the X-Files, people want to believe, almost in like a religious sense. There's a whole dogma and ideology that comes along with the Hollywood portrayal of the narrative. The interesting thing, though, for me, is that it's not all nefarious, right? I mean, we like to paint it as good guys, bad guys, evil spiritual entities. The Christian argument is usually, this is something evil and nefarious that we don't want to deal with. However, there seems to be a benevolent piece to this as well. Like people who are actually like talking about encounters or being involved in this say that it's not all one-sided. Pardon the pun, but there's a lot of gray area in the UFO. So it's interesting because you have stories of, like, for example, nuclear test fires that during the height of the Cold War, where these weapons would be disarmed in midair by like some orb that would just appear, some sort of spacecraft or flying craft that, as far as we know, it is far advanced to any sort of technology we have, violating our understanding of the laws of physics, and it would just disarm these missiles in midair. The Foo Fighters is another example. People would recount how it seemed like the Foo Fighters were actually trying to deter hostilities in some instances. So it seems like that, going back to this idea of the flying Vimanas, and if the gods really do fly these crafts, then maybe there's good ones and there's bad ones, right? But it does seem like, as we're coming into the modern era, that this is more human activity than supernatural activity. So, for example, we come into the 80s, you hear the name Bob Lazar, somebody that most people in this field are very familiar with, right? Well, Bob Lazar is saying that, if even half of what Bob Lazar says is true, like, our worldview should be just completely turned on their head, because that means that our governments are keeping so many things from us that we haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg yet.
Right.
Bob Lazar was talking about, element 115, like 20 years before this became common knowledge, basically saying that the government had basically figured out a way to create a new element. And they did this in Area 51, a secret location. And, he understood the timing of when they were going to test these saucers and these spacecraft. So he would actually take people out to see it, and just right on cue, they would appear in the skies over Arizona and New Mexico when he said they would. So it seemed like Bob Lazar, somebody that I actually do think is absolutely credible and has been discredited as part of an intentional mission to discredit him. I think, his work and the work of others. Another guy who comes to mind is Boyd Bushman, who was the head of Skunk Works for Lockheed Martin up until like the 2000s. Well, Bushman went to his deathbed saying that the U.S. government was in conversation with extraterrestrial entities. Bushman, who knows what they actually were? I don't think he even knew what they were, but he just said non-human entities. He called them aliens. We're in communication with our government. So, to answer your question, I think that somewhere along the line, the technology got so advanced in human hands that primarily what you're seeing now is advanced human tech. And some of it gets misidentified. Like, for example, the SR-72, which is the replacement to the SR-71 spy plane that was used in the Cold War, it's shaped like a triangle almost. It's like from the ground, it would look like a black triangle in the sky. But that thing travels at 4,500 miles an hour. It can be anywhere on the planet within 1 hour. Anywhere. So if you saw one of those things whiz by over your head, you're going to say, dude, I just saw a UFO. And all your friends are going to say, whoa, yeah, I saw a UFO too. But, that can be corroborated. We have, blueprints of this aircraft, and we can say, no, that's the SR-72. So that's how advanced our technology's gotten, that a lot of this is misidentification. So if there are little green men, the stereotypical view of, the aliens, I think that they're very, very much removed from the forefront and behind the scenes. But I do think that there is still, that presence there, kind of, existing probably separately from the technology that was given to us. Because nowadays you hear about, orbs, fireballs. I actually had an encounter in Bucks County, Pennsylvania a few years ago where I saw a ball of fire in the sky. It looked like a Chinese lantern, but like 50 times bigger. And this thing was moving, at the speed of an airplane, so it definitely wasn't a Chinese lantern. And it just looked like a giant orb in the sky. Now, it wasn't ball lightning. I watched it for minutes. I mean, it seemed like it went on forever. My wife saw it too. And then eventually just the light disappeared and it was gone. I've had a few similar sightings like that. I had a supervisor at a former job who saw a black triangular UFO over Villanova University in Pennsylvania. Things like that, I tend to think is just our government. I mean, testing new aircraft. It could have been the SR-72 for all I know. But I do think that there is a spiritual component here. I think crop circles, even though a lot of that has been kind of debunked as basically spoof and some sort of just prank. I think the origin of the crop circle phenomena was actually real as well. Some of those crop circles were way too elaborate. They had sorts of geometrical patterns that just seemed to have a spiritual context to them. References to Sumerian deities. I remember one crop circle that popped up in the early 2000s. When he translated it, it said, "I am Enki," who was a Sumerian deity, which is interesting. And then there was another one. That seemed to be a response to a code that we had sent out into the cosmos a couple decades prior, with an image of human DNA. It seemed to be a response with an image of alien DNA. So I do think that there's something going on behind the scenes there, but I don't think it's all one-sided. I don't think it's all evil or all good. I think it's more of a mixed bag. And as to how that works and how we should understand it in terms of worldview and zeitgeist, the jury's still out for me, man. But I think that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, and guys like Bob Lazar, Boyd Bushman, and others who have come forward. Stanton Friedman looked into this for a long time. Those kind of guys, I think they would say the same thing, that this is much more, it's much more ambiguous and less straightforward in terms of understanding the intent and the powers that be behind it. I think that there could be opposing forces, even on that level, behind the scenes, both human and non-human. But I don't think that these are aliens or little green men coming from other galaxies. I think that if this phenomena is non-human, the evidence to me seems to indicate that it's either interdimensional or that it's supernatural, spiritual in context, or it could actually just be terrestrial. The theory that these things come from inside of the earth or from under the ocean. USO sightings are almost as common, if not as common, as UFO sightings. So unidentified submerged objects. People talk about these things flying into the sea. Wouldn't surprise me in the least to find out one day that a lot of this activity is actually just going on beneath our oceans. Dulce Base, for example, too, underground caves and military bases, things like that. So I don't think this is an extraterrestrial, quote-unquote, phenomena. I think that they're very much terrestrial in the sense that they've been here for a long time, and they've probably been here longer than us.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, that's fascinating. And I just had a conversation with Darren Geisinger, and we were talking about the deep underground military bases, because I brought up the name Phil Schneider. And if you guys have ever done any research into Phil Schneider, you know that he was the one who exposed Dulce, New Mexico as what it is, this deep underground military base. He details a story there where he supposedly got caught in the crossfire between green and black berets and these alien reptilians. Actually, I think they were tall grays is what he refers to them as, and they look exactly like the clone people in Star Wars Attack of the Clones, that movie, that planet where they go to. They're those tall, weird-looking lizard things. So he details them as similar to that. But it's interesting just because, gosh, this planet is so big and we don't really know the depths of the planet or what's really under there. I mean, maybe someone does know, but from a research standpoint, it's very hard to find evidence to, physical evidence. We can go off of people's words and documentation and stuff, but to actually get like a picture of one of these things or, that type of thing, it's going to be very difficult to do that. Man, we're coming close up on an hour here.
Yeah.
I want to kind of go into now, what does this mean for Christians, and why is it important for us as believers in Christ to examine this? Why should we even care? Like, how does this pertain to the gospel? And so I brought up Josh Peck and Derek Gilbert. They wrote a book called The Day the Earth Stands Still, which is named after the 1959 movie, The Day the Earth Stands Still, where this alien entity comes to Earth and lands his spaceship, and it's this big old debacle. But they present some information here that I thought was interesting. So let's see, where do I want to begin? So in the beginning of the book, they're talking about what I'm talking about. Why should Christians care? And so they gave some statistics that they found out in a Barna uh, experiment, or in a survey that they did. So a couple of points here. 61% agree with ideas rooted in new spirituality, new age teaching. 54% resonate with postmodernistic views. So they're surveying America, right? And this is the American results. 36% accept ideas associated with Marxism. 29% believe ideas based on secularism. So among the Christians drawn from new spirituality that have entered the church, Barna found that about a third of American Christians strongly agree that if you do good, you will receive good. If you do bad, you will do bad. More than a quarter, 28%, strongly agree with the statement that all people pray to the same God or spirit, no matter what name they use for the spiritual being. The influence of postmodernism is reflected in the finding that 23% of America's practicing Christians strongly agree that what is morally right or wrong depends on the individual beliefs. And that is some pretty staggering numbers, because what that tells me is that people are looking for answers. Right. And I think we started off this conversation talking about these gods flying in the heavens. We talked about Ezekiel having this vision of Yahweh coming to him on a Babylonian throne. And so just a question for you. What would you say if a god showed up to you in a UFO? What would you say if this entity, like, said, I am God, has this spiritual just persona about him, and it shows up to you in this craft that just blows your mind? You're gonna start questioning your worldview. You're gonna start questioning, well, is the Bible true? The Bible doesn't really say anything about this. How am I supposed to respond to this? If we wake up tomorrow and there's a huge UFO over New York City, what do we say as Christians? And so I think, these findings show us that Christians don't really believe in the Bible. They don't really believe what the Bible says. But does the Bible address these questions? Does the Bible address the alien UFO phenomena? And I think it's important that we do research into this for that fact, so that we know how to defend what is coming, this disclosure, if you will. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I was actually just going to spin that around on you. I'm actually curious to know, what do you think, in particular, to understanding it within the context of a Christian worldview, right? Like, what do you make of, for example, like the abduction phenomena? What do you think the deeper meaning is behind that, and how does that, interact with your faith? Because to your point, you said, the Bible doesn't really talk about this, and it doesn't, but we have people all over the world, like, you got the Barney and Betty Hill story, Travis Walton, the guy from Fire in the Sky. Some of these seem like credible stories. Others I call into question. But like, there seems to be a serious spiritual component to that, right? Like, if these people are actually experiencing what they're experiencing, like, there's like biological testing being done, semen samples being taken. Some people talk about like human alien hybrids, things like that. That to me, it would call into question my faith, or like my spiritual worldview, if I found myself in that situation, because I would say, I don't know if I have an answer for this. I don't know how this fits with my understanding of the cosmos, or how the world works, or my belief system, right? So what do you make of that? Like, not necessarily putting yourself in those shoes, but like hearing those accounts. Do you see that as kind of just like hyperbole and bunk? And I'll give you my view on it in a second, but what do you think, and how would that affect, your faith? To your point, like, if one of these things just appeared and said, hey, I'm a god, but I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to fix you. I'm here to improve your DNA. I'm here to improve your offspring, your next generations. Here to improve the planet. What do you make of that?
Oh gosh, that's a in-depth question. There's three things. The first thing would be, two scriptures come to mind. The first is, Paul talks about you will know the height, depth, breadth, and width of God's love, right? And he mentions 4 there, and a lot of scholars take that to mean that there's an extra dimension. There's something else there that we don't see with our 3-dimensional reality, and that's in Ephesians. The second scripture that comes to mind is to test the spirits. and this kind of goes in line with my third view, of really knowing your Bible and being literate in the Word of God. Because with just studying prophecy and stuff, if you have an opportunity to sit down, let's say an alien comes to you and wants to have a conversation. I'm just giving this an example because, the Vatican's talking about these alien saviors coming down. If they want to get baptized, then great. So that means that there's an opportunity to have a discussion with them. So first, if you're doing apologetics, I'm into apologetics. You want to find out really what these people believe, right? Or these entities believe. You want to ask questions. If we have that opportunity. And so you'd be able to find out what they think about Jesus. In most of these accounts, Jesus is just this great moral man who brought a lot of good teachings, but he wasn't the savior of the world, right? So to me, that's demonic. That's straight from the enemy, if you want to use that terminology. If you don't have an opportunity to have this conversation, for instance, you're just abducted in your sleep, and something happens. This kind of brings to mind the incubus succubus thing, where you get these demons prowling around, these sexual demons and people astral projecting and stuff like that. But at the same time, for whatever reason, on the accounts of incubus and succubus that I've read, that with Christians experiencing that, they always have an opportunity to rebuke this entity in the name of Jesus, and it goes away. And I just thought about that astral projection. That's another interesting thing, because you can have human spirits coming down and doing stuff to you, or you could have Satanists sending demons to take you away, similar to what you see in like Paranormal Activity, where that person gets drug out of bed. Like, I think that stuff can really happen, and you don't know what it is. You're just being taken against your will, and you can't see anything happening. So I think, like you were saying earlier, there's a lot more to this than just it's a demonic spirit, or there's people out there who can astral project outside of their body and come and interact with the physical realm in some way or form. And so those are just a few of my thoughts off the top of my head. Ultimately, we have to weigh everything against the Word of God. And gosh, when it comes to this paranormal activity, when it comes to this fringe stuff that the Bible doesn't necessarily talk about, I do think it's important that we realize that we do live in a spiritual world. And I think it's important that we realize the strength that we have through the Holy Spirit and the blood of Jesus that's been put over us.
Yeah. Good answer. I personally think that there's a nefarious component to this, even demonic component to it.
Yeah.
I'm also in the camp that believes that there's a benevolent counterpart to it. And maybe you could say this is like the classic angels versus demons, setup. I tend to think it's a bit bigger than that and broader. It's one of these things where we just don't know what we don't know, right? I mean, we don't know what's beyond that level of supernatural existence, right? The Bible talks about angels, demons, these four-faced creatures, the seraphim, the cherubim, etc. But apart from a narrow scope, I mean, it doesn't ever claim to have a monopoly of explanation in the text, right? So there could be all sorts of things going on behind the scenes that we know nothing of. I personally believe that there is this, to use a biblical phrase, like war in the heavens going on, and that we're kind of playing a part in it. I don't know if this is like an angels and demons paradox, though. It could very well be extraterrestrial. It wouldn't really shatter my worldview, to be honest with you, if I found out that it was. But I don't claim to know what it is. What I do know, when I was a teenager, I experienced sleep paralysis a few different times, and I definitely believe there was an evil or demonic component to it. I've actually done a podcast on this over on Eschaton. I called it the waking terror, because that's what it was for me. I was wide awake, but I know, I know there was another entity in the room with me, and this happened on multiple accounts. I never experienced anything that felt like an abduction, but I've met people who claim that they have. And not to belittle their experiences, but I found that a lot of times the abduction experience, for me, more times can be explained away more easily than the sleep paralysis account. Sometimes sleep paralysis even is more just has to do with like a bad diet or like poor sleep habits, things like that. Your mind is a very powerful tool and weapon, and it can project all sorts of things, like, the old hag, the incubus, the succubus. I tend to think that a lot of that is actually rooted in something real and tangible. But a lot of it also is psychology and like suppressed trauma from past generations that could still exist within your DNA. But for me, the sleep paralysis thing, I mean, call it a ghost, whatever you want. It felt like a ghost or poltergeist type activity, but that happened multiple times. Other people have recounted something similar, but in correlation with an abduction type experience. Like the movie The Fourth Kind of touches on this. Like you experience the sleep paralysis, and it wakes you up right before you get sucked out of your bed and into this abduction type scenario. Now, something interesting about that, and we can kind of start to wrap it up with this, but Dr. Richard McNally, I think you and I talked about this on the phone yesterday. He's a psychologist at Harvard. He did an interesting study on this over several years. He actually brought in a lot of patients who claimed to have experienced alien abduction to try to get to the bottom of this. Like, is there this dark, nefarious thing going on where people are actually being abducted and taken out of their beds at night? And what he found was that there was actually a close correlation with PTSD and past trauma with abduction experiences. So these people actually believed that they were being abducted by aliens at night. But what he says in his findings, what they led him to believe was that they were actually tapping into past trauma. And get this, the number one source of past trauma he said they were tapping into was subconscious memories of the birthing process coming through the birth canal. Yeah, so it makes sense, right? Babies have memories. We may not remember it. Your earliest memories probably come around the age of 4 or 5. Most people have that. But this idea that you can tap into flashes of traumatic experiences in infancy, science has actually shown that is possible. And if that's the case, then it would make perfect sense, because what do you see in the classic abduction experience, right? You get taken out of a comfortable, warm, secure place, your bed. You're ripped into a bright lit room. Usually you're on a gurney or a bed. You can't really see the faces of the entities. It's kind of like that gray type face.
Blurry.
Yeah, blurry, stoic. And they're usually using medical utensils and procedures, touching you in certain ways. That's classic birthing canal process. Like, that's a baby coming out of the womb. So I tend to think Dr. McNally's work and others who have researched this have really pretty much put a stamp on it to say that a lot of these abduction stories can really be explained by traumatic experiences, number one, namely being the birthing process. But I do think there is that slim 5-10% of people who have had genuine abduction experiences. One of them would be Travis Walton, the guy from Fire in the Sky. But I tend to think that was probably not aliens. I think he might have stumbled into like black ops and like government testing UFOs, because he actually, in that story, I think that was down in Arizona, by the way, he was a logger. Him and his buddies saw this orb sitting in the forest off the road, and he actually jumped out of the car and ran to it. And he actually got like underneath the propulsion system of it, and it says that he was blown backwards, and his friends took off thinking he was dead. Yeah, and if you ever read this guy's story, it's interesting. But his friends thought he was dead. Great friends, right? They just take off and leave him there. A few days later, this guy is found like delirious in a phone booth like the next town over. People thought he was dead. He'd been missing for a few days, and he comes back with this crazy story about being taken aboard an alien spacecraft and basically being experimented on. Well, I think that he very well could have been brought on board a craft, but I think it was probably like black ops, military type stuff, and they might have even implanted like false memories or something to basically cover up what was really going on. But in any case, I do think abduction stories happen. There may be a nefarious spiritual element behind it, but more times than not, I tend to think that the abduction piece, that dark piece, is actually existing within our own psyche.
Dude, that's fascinating, and gosh, it just seems to be, it's weird to me. I'm going through Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. right now. Excuse me. And like all of this is tying in. I mean, the main guy, Coulson, who's like the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., he has all of his memories replaced through this government machine, right? This machine that the government developed, and he has, like, if you guys have ever seen Avengers, he was killed by the spear of Loki, and they bring him back to life using alien blood, altering his DNA, and then giving him false memories. Being replaced through it's crazy. Yes, it's crazy to me that they're showing us exactly, like, I don't know if it's intentional or if it's just it's coincidence, but it seems like there's this preparation that's taking place for some of this stuff to actually start happening in reality. And it making its way into the mainstream, the general public, if you will. So man, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up this conversation with, just how we take it as Christians, and to not, to question everything, to not just accept what the news says or what our pastor says even, but to do our own research and to really dig into these ideas, because they may seem fringe, but at the core of it, you see that there's a lot more to it than just flying saucers and aliens. It comes down to your worldview. It comes down to the historical accounts of all of this, going back to the Book of Enoch even. And so, do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I think that's a good place to bookend it, man. And to your point about how to deal with it, holding on to your worldview. I know most of your audience is going to be Christian listeners. A large portion of mine is as well. I would say hold on to your beliefs and use that as your foundation to guide you through, but never stop seeking and asking questions, right?
Yeah.
There may be more there, and it doesn't have to be a threat. It doesn't mean that it's going to contradict or negate any of your sincerely held beliefs. It might just be a piece of the puzzle that hasn't been revealed to you yet, and that's okay. We don't need to have all the answers, but I don't think you're going to find anything by exploring this that's going to turn your world on its head. I think you're actually going to find confirmation of a lot of the things we discussed tonight, that there is a deep human element to this, but there also is probably an ancient piece, and that's okay, because we know that, right? We know that there is a spiritual or unseen war battle going on around us all the time, and this just confirms it, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Well, for those of you tuning in, I've had Josh Wisely on my channel today with Apoloneering, and you can check him out at Eschaton, his podcast, on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, all those platforms. So make sure you guys check that out. Also consider becoming a member of the Daily Renegade using the link below and subscribing to the channel. So Josh, thanks for joining me, man. Gosh, such a good conversation. We got to do it again sometime.
Sounds good, Seth. I enjoyed it. Let's do it again sometime, man.
All right. Sounds good. All right, guys, we'll catch you on the next episode. You guys know the saying, don't be lazy, do the research.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.